On Her Blindness by Adam Thorpe is a really remarkable poem, and fairly touching. And I find it remarkable because it does ever such a lot with a little. Ostensibly, on the surface, it appears to be mainly narrative. Tells you the story through the narrator of a son whose mother was going blind, and he tells the story of her increasingly severe condition up till the point of her death in the poem. And if you can read it on that level, you can read it just as a very familiar story of coping with a parent who is aging, or coping with your advancing years yourself. But there is so much more to the poem, which isn't always evident straight away. And to begin with, I think one of the main conceits of the poem is that it's a reference, an intertextual reference to the poet John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. And Milton is considered to be the father of English literature. And he wrote a number of really important texts in English literature, perhaps most importantly Paradise Lost. And he became blind. By the time that he was writing those important texts, he was almost completely blind. And the poems and his writing were all transcribed for him by his daughter. So here we've got a slight reversal of that, in which the son is telling the mother's story for her. But he has become the poet in this case. So there's a link there between the importance of poetry in telling family stories. So we've got that intertextual reference to John Milton. And as we get into the beginning of the poem, we can see that the poem is written in blank verse, but mainly in iambic pentameter. So those 5 pairs of beats in which the second syllable is stressed. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it's a tribute to Milton. Milton's poetry is set out in the same way. So there's a sense that, like Milton's work, to the poet, to the narrative voice, this story of his mum has become epic. You know, it's like an epic poem, which is a style of poems that Milton wrote. It might just be about one son and one mother, but to him, she was his whole world, so it becomes a story of almost international importance. It's also an elegy, which is a poem that you might write about someone to praise them after their death. And they're sometimes written in pentameter, sometimes written in tetrameter, so you could argue that the pentameter fits in with that. And as I always say, the other reason I think that it's important is because when we talk, particularly when we're emotional in English, we tend to naturally fall into the rhythm of pentameters. So it's important, I think, that the poet makes this poem epic in the sense of the story it's telling, but also conversational in another. And just like Milton, he manages to cross that divide between a poem which in tone is partly very formal, which I'll come back to in a moment, but partly conversational. And we're like that as human beings, aren't we? You know, some of the time we are very aware of ourselves and being very formal and doing things that are very important, but everybody is capable of kind of informality and love and affection, and it really sums up that contrast, I think, in that tone. So let's start to have a look at the poem. My mother could not bear being blind, to be honest. One shouldn't say it. One should hide the fact that catastrophic handicaps are hell. So notice that the poet is using the formal third person pronoun one instead of she. So he could have said, my mother could not bear being blind, to be honest. She couldn't bring herself to say it. He's doing reported speech here, isn't he? He's saying what the mother said. So he's reporting a conversation, in which she has said, "I cannot bear being blind. One ought not to talk about it. One ought to hide the fact that you've got this terrible affliction." So as I said, that's a third person pronoun. It's very formal. So again, perhaps thinking about Milton and trying to make the poem seem very formal, very important, almost epic in tone. But also, it takes away the reference to the individual, doesn't it? She doesn't say, "I ought not to talk about this." She says, "one," people. The easiest way to replace the word "one," I suppose, with the synonym is with the word "people." People ought not to talk about it. So again, this raises, it elevates the tone of the poem to one that's not just about one woman, one mum, but one about all people. It's really about the human condition. What's it like to be a human being when you have got a serious illness or affliction? And what is it like to know that you're dying? And what is it like to know that your parent is dying? One should hide the fact that catastrophic handicaps are hell, one tends to hear publicly from those who bear it like a Roman. So a couple of different things going on there. We've got this consonance of the H sound. Handicaps are hell, one tends to hear and hide as well. So we've got consonants of the H sound. I would suggest that suggests frustration, irritation that she's feeling. And that mirrors what she says next, or what the poet says on her behalf, is that you should bear it like a Roman, meaning that if you've got something wrong with you, an illness or a disability, you should just get on with it, stiff upper lip, and uses the simile like a Roman to describe that. Now, that's got two references really. He's referring to a particular type of Roman, people from ancient Roman times, who are known as Stoics. And a Stoic, and we still use the word Stoicism today to reflect this, a Stoic believed that you had to just put up with things in life. If there was pain, if there was discomfort, if there's suffering, it's part of the human challenge of being a human being, that you simply put up with that and get on with your life. And almost the more suffering that you put up with, the better human being you would become. And Milton as well, there's a further reference to Milton here. Milton was known to be a Stoic. He followed that philosophy, he followed that way of living, and he was known also to have suffered a lot in his life and put up with it quietly. So, you either suffer like a Roman or you somehow find joy in the fight. And I rather like the fact that the mum is quite combative with her blindness. She doesn't give in, she refuses to be needy. And then he tells an anecdote. So he uses anecdote really here, moving back into his voice now rather than the reported speech. She turned to me once in a Paris restaurant, still not finding the food on her plate with her fork, or not so that it stayed on, try it in a pitch black room, and whispered, "It's living hell to be honest, Adam." So first of all, we've got a kind of comedy here where the mum is trying to pick up her food, she can't, and sometimes she gets it on her fork and it kind of pings off her fork. And they're in a Paris restaurant, so there's an inference here that they are somewhere very grand. So an inference of grandeur, which increases the bathos of all the food pinging off her fork. And Thorpe uses bathos 2 or 3 times in the poem. And bathos is when you use comedy as in an anticlimax. So it's, for example, if you said, my boyfriend left me and my heart broke into 1,000 pieces, so you'd have all that high emotion there. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces, just like when you drop something and it smashes into bits. And that's bathos. There's an anticlimax there. And often people make it worse with kind of crude comedy. So, references to things that are inelegant or rude in some way. Here it's not rude, but there is an inelegance to her food pinging off her fork. And yet at the same time, she confesses to him here that actually she's considering suicide if she doesn't recover from her blindness. There's a poignancy here because she calls him by his name. It's a living hell, to be honest, Adam. So she uses this metaphor. Again, possibly a reference to Milton, because in Paradise Lost, Satan, or Lucifer as he's called then, is expelled from heaven. He's a rebel angel, falls down into chaos and creates hell and lives there. So does she feel like Lucifer as someone who was once much valued by God and now is on her own? So she says that if I gave up hope of a cure, I'd bump myself off. Adam, of course, is another character that appears in Paradise Lost. So the whole poem is imbued with references to Milton. Imbued is a lovely word, which means kind of soaked through. It just gives you an alternative to saying full of references to, imbued with. It's a nice way to put it. I don't recall what I replied, but it must have been the usual sop, inadequate, the locked-in sun. So here is a really striking moment where she says that if I give up hope, if I start thinking I won't be cured, I'm likely to commit suicide. And he says, I can't remember what I said back. And I would suggest here that he's kind of blocking emotion. Probably can't remember what he says. But he describes what he probably said as sop. So something wet and pathetic and soggy, something inadequate. He'd be a locked-in sun. So he uses a sort of triplet here to emphasise his feelings of inadequacy. And at the beginning of the poem, I get a real sense that he feels that she is powerful, she is strong, even though she's the person with the disability, and he's just trying to kind of keep up with her and he doesn't know what to do. She kept her dignity though, so again another sense that the mum in the poem is a strong person, even when bumping into walls like a dodgem. So we've got another sense of bathos here. So he uses a simile, and first of all she's very dignified, and then says, well, she was bouncing into walls like a bumper car, at the fairground. So there's that anticlimactic moment where he uses a kind of comic idea to express her movements. Her sense of direction did not improve when cast inward. No built-in compass, as my father joked. So more reported speech. So there's a sense here that this woman is being observed by other people. Again, a comment on the human condition. What is it like to have a long-term illness? What is it like to have an illness that you know is deteriorating? And he uses the reported speech really effectively a couple of times to show what it must feel like to be being spoken about because you are the person with the disability. Instead, she pretended to ignore the void or laughed it off. Now, void here is given a double meaning because she can't see. Everything to her looks blank and dark. It is like a void when she looks, but also the void of her future. The idea that as she looks forward, she feels hopeless. And again, when Lucifer in Paradise Lost fell down from heaven, he falls into chaos, which at one point is described as an empty void. Then we move into the second part of the poem as she really starts to deteriorate. Saw things she couldn't see and smiled, as when the kids would offer the latest drawing or show her their new toy. So we'd forget at times that the long, slow slide had finished in a vision as blank as stone. So this seems quite narrative, quite a charming description of her grandchildren showing her pictures that they've drawn or a toy, and her simply pretending that she can see what they're showing her. Oh, that's nice, darling, or something. Really, really touching. But also throughout this section there is sibilance, and there's that continued use of the elegaic form. So there's a real sense of pathos to it, so a genuine poignancy, and sadness. For instance, she continued to drive the old Lanchester long after it was safe down Berkshire lanes. She'd visit exhibitions, admire films, sink into television while looking the wrong way. And he continues to use sensory imagery here of what she was feeling, watching, doing. And that is very much in contrast with a woman who is losing her senses, isn't it? So that's very clever to combine those two things. Then we get to her last week alive. Notice that that comes after an end stop. A fortnight back. So unusually the poet tells you he's writing about his current situation. So that's very poignant and touching, isn't it?